Hello again. In this second audio blog segment, number 2024-02, I will continue reading the novel Tares Among the Wheat by H. Melvin James. If you haven't listened to the first segment, you should do that before listening to this one. At the end of the previous segment, Amelia was attending the funeral service of her estranged grandfather. There are less than a dozen persons in attendance at this small chapel, a solitary structure adjacent to a cemetery in a sparsely populated rural vicinity. As I suggested in the first audio segment, continue to notice references to the wind and variations from breeze to storm. I resume reading now from page 15. Amy, and to a lesser extent others of the congregation, had just then been startled by the intrusion of a maverick gust of icy wind. Prelude to winter's southward advance, the gale had inexplicably erupted from an otherwise tranquil afternoon of late October. The pulse of Arctic air abruptly rammed the pair of entrance doors to open inward, banging them loudly in unison against the vestibule walls. Nuzzled by the entrance passage, the blast of chilled air then jettisoned down the chapel's center aisle. As the air raced forward, it gathered a concoction of dust from the floor, and scraps of papers lifted from the pockets of the pews, to mix with the colorful curled autumn leaves ushered indoors from their respite corners of the front porch. As the cold blast buffeted against the knee-high podium, its turbulence toppled a woven straw basket of freshly cut flowers and spread them artfully beneath the drab black casket, producing an arced palette of color against dusty dull floorboards. With its expiring breath, the wind's tail sent the empty flower basket cartwheeling, depositing it to rest at the feet of the speaker, Reverend Du Bois. The disruption halted his confabulation in mid-sentence and left him looking dumbfounded. As soon as the air blast ended, the building reacted as Sir Isaac Newton prescribed. It exhaled its bloat of force-fed atmosphere back out through the doorway from whence it came. As the building decompressed, the wall timbers and ceiling joists creaked in protest, and then the beams resumed their slumber. The comparatively timid exhalation, however, only partially reclosed the tandem entrance doors, leaving them creaking eerily against their rusty, reluctant hinges. All else was silence. Mrs. Thayer had been the last to arrive. Attempting to enter quietly, she had failed to fully engage the decades-worn latches. Now, voluntarily accepting the chore, the frail, silver-headed elder woman rose gracefully from her seat near the back, hastily approached, and closed the doors. Distinct metallic clanks assured the congregation the bolts were now set with certainty. Then, with 6 quick clicks of heels to hardwood, she regained her isolated seat. For a moment following, the sanctuary was again awkwardly silent until throats began meekly to growl themselves clear and aching posteriors stirred against the hard oak benches. The distraction of the wind had interrupted Ralph Haggett's lewd indulgence, which was, as he defined it to himself, a detailed visual appraisal of the young widow's fine feminine qualities. The lawyer had summarily concluded Amelia was both smartly and attractively dressed. Certainly, the wardrobe was not expensive. He reasoned, however, as superbly as she modeled her garments, any finery would have been of little significance to his lustful perspective. Earlier, before the funeral commenced, from across the room he had meticulously scrutinized her every detail. He had visually traced the geometry of her black skirt, beginning just below her knees, then upward as it gently expanded to blend into the curvature of her thighs, and higher as it sensually transitioned into her perfectly proportioned hips. His trace of this line concluded slightly above the apex of the hip, where the curvature disappeared under the flared bottom of her matching black jacket. Her contour, he reflected, was as geometrically exquisite as the instrument dubbed the French curve, of an architect's drafting templates. Then, continuing his inspection of the subject's torso, he observed the jacket's fine tailoring, artfully emphasizing the taper of her waist and the delicate concave of her lower back, which angled up to meet the perfect posture of her squared shoulders. With delight, Haggett recalled glimpses of his subject from moments earlier. At the front of her jacket, 3 large ebony buttons clutched the material taut around her lower trunk. There, the underside lobes of her breasts distinctively formed the material on either side of the upper button. From that top fastener, wide lapels flared up, outward and apart, framing an exquisite pale blue blouse, blossoming in ruffles and lace in the manner of a bundle of chrysanthemums overwhelming their basket. He imagined plump bare breasts nestled there beneath the layers of garments. Having regained her composure, Amy felt about her hairdo to ensure the rolls and tucks had remained intact. Beatrice, her close friend since childhood and now, as she had bragged, an accomplished cosmetologist, taught Amy the art of beautifying oneself, applying makeup and styling hair, without assistance. Be at times remarked of Amy's magnificent hair and enviable complexion, claiming her attributes denied a beautician the opportunity to accomplish dramatic improvements, as be boasted to be her talent, albeit most applicable to her unfortunate homely clientele. Nevertheless, Beatrice admitted, it was a rare treat to work with such a natural cover girl as my very best friend. When Amelia informed her best friend of her appointed journey, to travel by a Greyhound bus to a small town in northwest Oklahoma, Beatrice was inquisitive. Learning that Amy would be attending the reading of the will and then the funeral of her purported maternal grandfather, Bea insisted Amy's 10-year-old son, Stuart, should remain in St. Louis with her. This way, Bea reasoned aloud, he won't fall behind in his schoolwork, he won't have to sit through a morbid funeral, and, she emphasized, and at long last, you can be on your own for a few days to pursue adventure, or maybe. She then pronounced melodramatically romance. Amy recalled how Beatrice had grinned and winked to punctuate the exaggerated final word. Bea had frequently chided Amy about having respectfully played the part of the frigid widow quite long enough. Bea had argued, it's time for you to consider, and occasionally accept, some of the many overtures you receive from attractive eligible men. And if you insist on re-embarking into a conventional courtship, then why not begin meekly with an innocent dinner date? Then, if the first date sparks any interest, allow a second date to include a movie. By the third date, if you haven't frightened the man away, like a mouse in a fox den, you should feel brave enough to go dancing. Amy, girl, at least accept an invitation to a boring and totally unromantic afternoon at a Cardinals baseball game, for heaven's sake. Recalling the moment gave Amy an involuntary smile. Then, feeling self-conscious, she quickly reassumed a sober expression, one more befitting the solemn occasion of last rites. From her seat in the front right pew, Amelia turned to glance at the several persons scattered about the small church. As she caught Mr. Haggett's stare, his indecorous grin faded faster than he could train his eyes away. Upon their first meeting, as he had then apologetically excused, he was staring at her only because he was startled by her remarkable resemblance to her grandmother. But as Amy noticed with disgust, his eyes were not trained on her face, but on her breasts. Amelia reluctantly accepted her position of lineage in the McClary clan, but with reservation. She would realize only a pittance from an inheritance, if any monetary amount at all, but she could accept that. However, as next of kin and sole surviving adult descendant, she feared being saddled with funeral costs and any unresolved debts of her insolvent grandfather. As a low-income widow with a growing child, it was essential for Amy to carefully manage every dollar she earned to ensure her and her son's basic needs, food, clothing, and shelter, and occasionally find a few extra dollars for a rare treat or outing. Amy hoped the uncanny affair of her estranged grandfather's passing would not complicate and trouble her meager and precarious financial status, or her fragile but hopeful emotional state. She felt incapable of enduring any more heartache, responsibility, or toil above her current burden. She toyed with the notion, but almost seriously, of her predicament being equivalent to the proverbial beast of burden. She was consciously aware of the load she bore, and she feared one more straw could indeed prove fatal. As Mr. Haggett had explained to Amelia, seated in her living room only a week earlier, the critically ailing Lexington McClary had given him urgent dispatch. His duty was to locate and report on the McClary's lost daughter, living or dead, and any of her children or grandchildren, living or dead. There had been several previous investigative attempts over many years, but all had failed. With no expense spared, some among the various private investigators and independent lawyers had gleaned weeks and months of easy meal tickets through their half-hearted and sometimes inept routines. More recently, increasing flexibility in the privacy laws had wedged open traditionally inaccessible office doors and file cabinet drawers. Concurrently, the increased popularity of genealogy research had plotted and posted generations of previously obscure family lineage. Thus, at long last, the lifelong quest of the now-aged and ailing Lexington McClary had become feasible. On the day Attorney Haggett first met with Amelia at her home in St. Louis, the shadow of death was already at the foot of Lexington McClary's bed. Amy resented the lawyer for not informing the dying old man that two of his descendants, a granddaughter and a great-grandson, at long last were located. After all the years and money devoted to the quest, to deny a dying man joyful news seemed a cruelly compounded tragedy. Amy first learned of the McClary family when she received a visitor, private investigator Mr. Vince Teague. During that conversation, the PI told Amy that her estranged grandfather had little time to live. He expressed his urgency to confirm her as a McClary descendant, a fact of which he was certain, then complete the formal report of his investigations, assemble his collection of evidence, and finally prod skeptical Mr. Haggett to inform their client of the triumphant and happy findings. 5 days later, after arriving in Rogersville, Amy asked Attorney Haggett if her grandfather had been informed of his granddaughter and great-grandson. He gave her a dispassionate and disappointing reply. Acting responsibly, I was determined to never inform Mr. McClary of any subjects we had tracked down until I could absolutely validate the person or persons. On one occasion in the past, my predecessor and law firm partner reported likely subjects, only to greatly upset Mr. McClary when further investigation proved they clearly were not descendants. By the time I had ascertained you to be genuine, the old man was in the throes of death. I believed he was then too incoherent to be informed. Ralph Haggett imagined himself to be an exceptionally clever and cunning professional. Any measure of such traits of his character, however, seemed only to manifest in serving his monetary greed or his imagined sexual prowess. In the case of Amelia's investigation, success sprang indirectly from the recommendation of a St. Louis municipal court judge. Thereby Haggett only incidentally happened to hire a capable private investigator, Mr. Vince Teague, as the judge had advised. It was Vince who essentially connected each node of information to the next until he arrived at Amelia's doorstep. On Vince's lead, Haggett prepared draft warrants and letters of requests for information. On more than one occasion, the documents, delivered by hand, served more as excuses for Vince to call on certain offices than they proved productive in themselves. Control of office files and ledgers was most often found in the charge of scrutinizing secretaries and regimental file clerks, and those administrators most often wore skirts. Despite the degree of a lady's disciplined adherence to office policy and regardless of her age, appearance, or marital status, the suave Vince Teague was adept at charming and acquiring from each at least enough information to gain the next clue. Mr. Haggett contracted Vince Teague at a daily rate plus expenses. The lawyer then liberally marked up both accounts into his own invoices, which he presented to his suffering and faintly cognizant client, Lexington McClary, to approve for payment. Over the previous 2 decades, Ralph Haggett had bilked the remains of the once lucrative McClary estate, liberally charging for time and expenses associated with the search for McClary heirs. Those over and above invoices were in addition to his monthly retainer and hourly rate for routine legal work for the McClary estate. As Lexington McClary's life waned in concert with the value of his net worth, the lackluster lawyer planned and proceeded to bleed the last remaining funds from the estate's bank accounts, whether the final search mission reached a conclusion and regardless of its success. Haggett had acquired the McClary account following the death of his senior law partner, the elderly Ben Duncan. The office's legal secretary, Margaret Bowman, had discovered Ben's cold corpse early one morning, seated stiffly behind his desk in his huge leather chair, fountain pen still in hand. No sooner was the body taken away before Ralph began triumphantly moving himself into the larger front office. Without regard for Duncan's widowed wife, Haggett summarily filed documents and affirmed claim to any and all rights and ownership as the sole surviving business partner. His spoils included the big leather chair and the 10-karat gold fountain pen he had pried from Ben's cold fingers before the undertaker arrived at the offices. In Ralph Haggett's opinion, all research of records, dispositions, and interviews aside, the stunning resemblance of the 3 generations of women, Doreen, Trudy, and Amelia, past to present, was the crown piece of evidence legitimizing Amelia's inheritance, meager as those remnants appeared to be. Extracted from Vince Teague's comprehensive report file, Haggett had pondered over the photographs of the 3 women. Their photographs, particularly those taken at similar ages in their lives, displayed extraordinary resemblance. Ralph rationalized such desirable traits of beauty surely must have been destined to persevere from prehistoric times, passing triumphal from one generation to the next. In his learned opinion, it was simply Darwinian preservation of the fittest, assuring survival, since, according to his own assessment, such refined beauty would exact the most advantageous and desirable mate, thus to perpetuate those superior genes in the feminine gender offspring of succeeding generations. Continuing her glancing consideration of each person at the funeral service, with her head turned over her left shoulder, at the edge of her peripheral vision, Amelia glimpsed a person she had not previously spotted among the small funeral congregation. Amy's view of the person was confounded by more than distortion at the periphery, for in the sky high above, the sun danced frantically with the passing clouds. Shards of the parsed sunlight pierced the chapel's stained glass windows, producing flickering splashes of color which were even more pronounced in the dark back corners of the church. There in the dim of dancing colorful beams of light, standing alone and against the wall at the rear left corner of the sanctuary, Amy discerned a small-framed woman of dark complexion. As if engaged in a religious trance, the odd woman stood frozen, one hand outstretched atop the other on her chest, eyes fixed in a stare toward the altar. In the one quick glance Amelia's keen perception had noted the woman's blue-black, full-length dress, trimmed richly in glossy black embroidery. She wore a black shawl that framed her face, crossed at her throat, and draped back over her shoulders. Her appearance suggested that of a distant culture of a bygone era, perhaps Eastern European in the late 19th century. Amy allowed graciously that the odd wardrobe appeared suitable for the petite woman of stark features, and it particularly befit the Orthodox occasion. Returning her attention to the funeral service, Amy noticed the pastor had nudged the empty flower basket behind his heels and was now stammering to regather his thoughts and resume his speech. And Jesus answered, "The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one." The preacher glanced up from his Bible to gauge his congregation's attention. Then he continued with his folksy accent, "Friends, I believe the message is clear. Just like the plants of the farmer's fields, when it is time for the Lord to harvest our souls, the tares will be separated from the wheat, and the tares will be cast into the lake of fire." Since the congregation was small and, apparently, in an attempt to seem more personable to the sole family member present, the preacher had, at the beginning of the service, stepped down from the podium to address Amelia in particular, and the gathering in general in a less formal fashion. Now, as he droned on with predictable verse, Amelia again pondered the curious woman standing alone in the shadows at the rear of the church. Amy purposely arrived early. She was greeted by the pastor, his wife, and the undertaker. Sitting alone in the pews, she then scrutinized each person entering the church, and except for the officiators and those few she had met the previous day, she had speculated the manner in which each may have known her grandfather. Continuing her analysis, if only to entertain herself, Amy wondered if the small dark woman had entered late, perhaps after the service began, thereby explaining why she was not seen earlier. Amy reasoned that the stranger could not have entered the church in accompaniment with the windblast, because the disruption caused herself and everyone in the congregation to immediately look toward the open doorway. Further, Amy surmised The curious little lady could not have so quickly entered the church and taken a stance so far from the doorway just as the wind rushed in and everyone turned to look. Conclusively, Mrs. Thayer was the last to arrive. Amy watched her turn and close the door, gently and quietly, upon entering. No one entered with her, and there was no one standing at the back wall at the time. Amelia retraced her memory and her recall of scenes. She was a careful observer of her world. Amy's pondering sparked a memory from her childhood. She recalled her mother's remarks vividly, but not verbatim. Amy, you have read so many episodes, or should I say escapades, of Nancy Drew, Agatha Christie, and other sleuths. You will surely grow up with no other ambition than to become a police detective, or perhaps a writer of such mysteries. After the brief fond remembrance, Amy continued her temporary pastime of analyzing the presence of the quaint but mysterious stranger. Amy recollected, following Mrs. Thayer's entrance, the door had remained closed until the wind gust intruded. The creaking door hinges would not have allowed the door to be opened quietly in the meantime. Thus, no one else entered through the main doors. The only other door was in front to the left of the podium. Perhaps then, Amy tried to conclude, the dark woman had been quietly standing there from before the time she arrived. Contradicting a different scenario, Amy deduced, if the lady had arrived before services began, it was rude for no one to have introduced her. It was also peculiar that the woman had not mingled with others and did not introduce herself to Amy. There was one last curious factor. The woman was standing alone at the back of the church while rows of pews sat vacant. This was the second of a series of readings from the epic novel, Tares Among the Wheat, by H. Melvin James. This novel is available worldwide, from all major online bookstores, as a paperback, hardcover, or ebook in various formats. Return to this website to hear the continuation of this saga. Thank you for listening.